Hey guys, tonight I need to tell you about a man who died in a small house in Smet, South Dakota on June 8, 1902. His name was Charles Philip Ingalls. You know him as Pa, the hero, the fiddler, the man with bright eyes who could make a home anywhere and turn hardship into a song, the father who loved his daughters so fiercely that he would load them into a wagon and chase the horizon until they found the place where everything would finally be all right. That is the story Laura told. But I want you to think about something tonight that Laura never wrote down, something that sits in the silence between the last page of these happy golden years and the day Pa's heart gave out in that little house on 3rd Street. A question. One that Pa may have carried with him as his breathing grew shallow and the room grew dim and his daughters sat beside him, holding his hands. Did I fail them? Did I ask too much? Did my dreams cost them more than I ever meant to give? We will never know what Charles Ingalls thought in those final moments. There is no deathbed confession, no diary entry where he weighs his choices against the cost his daughters paid. History does not give us that kind of closure, but history does give us something else, the record. And tonight, we're going to sit with that record the way you sit with 2 old ledgers, laid side by side on a kitchen table. One ledger marked, "What Pa dreamed." The other marked what his daughters carried. And when we turn the pages slowly, when we let the moves, the debts, the illnesses, the poverty, the work, the fear, and the quiet aftermath tell their own story, we're going to feel the weight of a question that Laura spent her whole life trying to answer without ever speaking it aloud. Was Pa a hero? Or was he a loving man whose restlessness cost his daughters more than he ever meant to ask? This is not a story about blaming Charles Ingalls. This is not a story about tearing down a myth to feel clever or superior. This is a story about what happens when you love your children deeply, believe in your dreams passionately, and never quite stop long enough to see what the cost of all that moving, all that risk, all that next chance did to the people who had no choice but to follow you. This is a story about daughters. Mary, who went blind at 14 and never married, living the rest of her 63 years dependent on the family that Pa's choices had shaped. Laura, who turned hardship into American mythology, but could never quite write the whole truth about what it cost to be Pa's daughter. Carrie, who did not marry until she was in her early 40s, spending decades caring for a blind sister and aging parents before she ever had a life of her own. Grace, the youngest, was born into poverty in a hotel in Iowa where Ma and Pa worked as servants to survive one of Pa's failures. 4 daughters, and not one of them had an easy life. Not one of them escaped the consequences of being Charles Ingalls' child. Tonight we are going to sit with that, not with anger, not with accusation, but with the painful, quiet realization that a father can love his children completely and still leave them wondering what his dreams cost them. Before we continue, let me say this to you directly. If you are finding yourself pulled into this story, if you are feeling something shift in the way you understand the Little House books, the way you see Pa Ingalls, the way you think about frontier mythology, and the daughters who paid the price for their father's restlessness, then you need to know that this is just the beginning. There are deeper questions here, harder truths, stories Laura almost told, then pulled back from, moments she left out of the books because they were too painful, too complicated, too real. And if you want to keep exploring those stories with me, if you want to understand not just what happened but why it mattered, then do one thing right now: subscribe. Because tonight we are starting with a question Pa might have asked himself at the end. But the story behind that question, the moves, the debts, the winters, the illness, the blind daughter, the poverty, the midnight departures, the love and the cost, that story takes time. It takes patience. It takes the willingness to sit with uncomfortable truths and let them reshape what you thought you knew. And I promise you, by the time we reach the end of tonight's story, you will never read Little House on the Prairie the same way again. Let me take you back to June 1902. Smet, South Dakota. A small prairie town that Charles and Caroline Ingalls had helped build 2 decades earlier. A town that Pa had finally stopped moving away from. A town where, for the first time in his adult life, Charles Ingalls stayed put. Not because the horizon stopped calling, but because his body gave out before he could answer it one more time. By the spring of 1902, Charles Ingalls was 66 years old. His heart was failing. He had been sick for weeks, the kind of sickness that makes it hard to breathe, Hard to move, hard to do anything but sit in a chair and let the people who love you try to make you comfortable. Caroline was there. Ma, the woman who had followed him across 4 states, through 20 moves, past crop failures and debts, and winters so brutal they nearly killed the whole family. She was 62 years old now, still strong, still the anchor. Mary was there, blind since she was 14, 43 years old, never married, never left home. Her whole adult life spent dependent on Ma and Pa, and whichever sister could take her in when Ma and Pa were gone. Carrie was there, 31 years old, unmarried, still living at home, still helping Ma care for Mary, still waiting for a life of her own. Grace was 25, married by then, living nearby. The only one of Pa's daughters who had managed to build a life separate from the weight of what Pa's choices had created. And Laura. Laura was not there. She was in Missouri, on Rocky Ridge Farm, the place she and Almanzo had finally managed to carve out after years of failure, debt, and survival that mirrored her childhood in ways she would spend the rest of her life trying to reshape into something bearable. She was 35 years old, a mother, a farmer's wife, and already, quietly, beginning to shape the story she would one day tell about Pa, the hero, the fiddler, the man who loved his daughters and did his best and built a life out of courage and grit, and the restless belief that the next place, the next chance, the next horizon would finally be the one where everything worked out. That was the story Laura would tell. But in June 1902, sitting in that little house on 3rd Street, what Pa saw around him was not the myth. What Pa saw was the reckoning. A blind daughter who would never have a husband, never have children, never have independence. A daughter still at home in her 30s, unmarried, her youth spent caring for a sister who could not see, and parents who were aging and tired. A wife who had followed him through hell and never complained out loud, but whose face, after all those years, must have carried the weight of every move, every failure, every winter they barely survived. And a daughter far away in Missouri, building a life that looked nothing like the one Pa had promised when he first loaded a wagon and told his girls they were going to a place where land was free and the future was bright. What did Pa think in those last weeks, when he could not breathe deeply anymore? When the room was quiet except for the sound of Caroline moving through the house, Carrie helping, Mary sitting still in her chair by the window, her hands folded, her sightless eyes turned toward a world she had not seen in 28 years. Did he think about all the times he had said just one more move? Did he think about the crops that failed, the debts he could not pay, the homes they left in the middle of the night to avoid the rent? Did he think about Mary? About the winter they nearly starved, the fevers that swept through, the moment the light went out of his eldest daughter's eyes and never came back? Did he wonder if he had asked too much? If the daughters he loved so fiercely, the daughters he fiddled for, sang to, told stories to, promised a better life to, did he wonder if they would have been better off if he had just stayed still? We do not know, because Pa did not write his story. Laura did. And the story Laura told was the one that let Pa be a hero. Here is what Laura did not write in the little house books. She did not write about the midnight departures. She did not write about Pa loading the wagon under cover of darkness, waking the girls from sleep and driving away before the landlord could collect the rent they owed. She did not write about how many times that happened. She did not write about the pattern, the restlessness that Pa inherited from his own father, Lansford Ingalls, a man who also could not stay in one place, who also chased horizons and left debts and moved his family over and over, until moving became the only language he knew. She did not write about what it cost Carolyn. To pack up the girls again, to leave another home, to start over in another place with less money, fewer resources, and the growing, gnawing fear that this was never going to stop. She did not write about what it cost Mary, to go blind in a family that was barely surviving, to become dependent at 14, to spend the next 49 years of her life as someone who could not leave, could not work, could not build a life outside the small rooms where her parents and sisters made space for her. She did not write about what it cost Carrie, to be the daughter who stayed, the one who did not marry young, who did not escape, who spent her 20s and 30s caring for a blind sister and aging parents, because someone had to. And she did not write about what it cost herself, to grow up poor, to grow up moving, to grow up watching her father chase dreams that never quite landed, to carry the weight of that childhood into her own marriage, her own farm, her own failures, and then, decades later, to sit down with a pencil and a stack of paper and decide which version of the story to tell. The version where Pa was a hero, or the version where Pa was a man who loved his daughters, but whose dreams cost them more than anyone ever counted. Laura chose the first version, but the second version is the one we're going to sit with tonight, not because Laura lied, but because Laura loved her father, and love does what love has to do to survive. There is something nobody tells you about the grasshopper summer of 1874. It did not come with a warning. One morning the fields outside Walnut Grove, Minnesota were green, actually green, which mattered more than you might understand right now, because green meant the Ingalls family had finally, for the first time in years, planted something that looked like it was going to make it. Charles had filed a claim on Plum Creek. He had dug his family into the earth, literally a dugout in the creek bank, and then built them a small frame house when the first crop earned enough to justify the lumber. Mary was 9 years old that summer. Laura was 7. The family had a church, a school, neighbours who knew their names. For a few seasons, the Ingalls family had something rarer than money on the Minnesota frontier. They had roots, and then the sky moved. Contemporary accounts describe it the same way, over and over, and if you read enough of them, you start to understand that no one who lived through it had language ready for what they were seeing. The Rocky Mountain locust, Melanoplus spretus, descended on southwestern Minnesota in clouds so dense they darkened the afternoon sun. Farmers in Redwood County reported hearing them before they saw them, a dry, papery hiss building on the horizon like a second wind. Then they landed, 6 inches deep on the ground on some accounts, stripping wheat stalks to bare sticks within hours, filling wells, clogging machinery, getting into the house through every gap in the siding, into the stored flour, into the bedding. Charles Ingalls lost his wheat crop. Not most of it. Not a bad portion of it. All of it. Sit with that for a moment, because the word crop failure has been in this story before. In Kansas, in Wisconsin, in the background noise of every frontier venture Pi attempted. But this particular failure had a weight the others did not. He had been here before with nearly nothing. He had moved before. But this time there were 4 girls depending on that wheat, and Mary was old enough to understand what bare fields meant, and Laura was old enough to watch her father's face when he walked back from the ruined rows, and neither of them wrote down what that walk looked like. But the record documents the silence that followed. Charles left. Not permanently, not in the way of a man who abandons. He left to find work, harvest labour, east of the worst of the infestation, wherever men with strong backs were still needed. The frontier economy had one reliable offer for men in his position. If your own crop is gone, you can always harvest someone else's. He spent at least 1 season working away from home in just this way, leaving Caroline Ingalls with the girls in the frame house on Plum Creek, managing what there was to manage, which was not much. Think about what Caroline managed. 4 daughters, a house that was better than the dugout but still a thin wooden shell against a Minnesota winter. Provisions that ran to a calculation rather than a comfort. And the knowledge, which she carried without complaint and without the luxury of putting it down, that the man she had followed across 3 state lines and 2 failed ventures was out somewhere east, swinging someone else's scythe, because the land he had promised her had been eaten by insects. The Wilder barn in New York was still full that year. James and Angeline Wilder, farming good land in Burke, Franklin County, a few miles outside Malone in northern New York, had a barn that was documented by county records and the accounts of those who visited it as a serious working structure. A building that held horses, cattle, stored grain, and the kind of accumulated equipment that only comes from years of farming soil that actually cooperates. Young Almanzo Wilder, who would later become the man Laura married, grew up in a household where the granary was never empty at the start of winter, where there were multiple horses, where a bad season was a setback, not an emergency, where a bad season could be absorbed. On Plum Creek in 1874, a bad season could not be absorbed. There were no cushions. There was no second barn. There was no grandfather's equity to draw against. No capital position built up over a generation on stable land. There was a man walking east to harvest someone else's grain, and a woman sitting in a frame house doing the arithmetic that doesn't appear in any ledger. This is the first thing the ledger leaves off, the emotional labour of women who kept the household together in the spaces between the entries, but the grasshoppers came back in 1875, in 1876, 3 consecutive seasons of the same devastation. The locusts would eventually go extinct. Melanoplus spretus was the last mass extinction of a North American species, wiped out in the late 1870s when settlers ploughed up the Montana river bottoms that served as the insect's primary breeding ground. But this is history's dark irony. The very agricultural expansion that destroyed the locust swarms also destroyed the Ingalls family's farming margin first. 3 years of failed crops. The family's roots in Walnut Grove, so carefully built, so briefly enjoyed, were coming loose. Something else happened in those years that Laura chose not to write about. She never wrote about her brother. His name was Charles Frederick Ingalls. The family called him Freddie. He was born on August 27, 1875. He died on August 27, 1876, on his first birthday, or within days of it. He had lived a full year, and then the little house books, all 8 of them, never mention him. Not once. And then the little house books, all 8 of them, across hundreds of thousands of words about the Ingalls family, never mention him. Not once. Pioneer Girl, Laura's original unpublished autobiography written in 1930 and not publicly available until Pamela Smith Hill's annotated edition in 2014, does acknowledge Freddie, briefly. Hill's annotations to the manuscript note his existence and the bare fact of his death. But even in Pioneer Girl, the closest thing to Laura's unfiltered memory, the loss is compressed into almost nothing. A name, a date, a space that doesn't expand. Why? You can theorize. You can say that infant mortality on the frontier was common enough to be almost expected, and that writing about it might have been more than Laura could shape into the optimistic arc her books required. You can say that Freddie died before Laura was old enough to form a conscious memory of him. You can say a lot of things that are probably partially true, but the silence is still a fact. The Ingalls family had a son. He lived for 9 months, in a period when the family was between homes, financially precarious, moving from a failed farm toward hotel work in Iowa. He died in the most difficult stretch of his parents' frontier marriage. His father was a man who loved his children with everything the record shows he had. And the silence around Freddie's death, the deliberate, sustained, total silence of 8 published books, tells you something that no amount of optimism can fully explain. Some losses are too heavy to carry in public. The Burr Oak period, roughly 1876 to 1877, is the only stretch of the Ingalls family story that Laura almost entirely excluded from her books. They were in Iowa, managing the Masters Hotel in a small river town, and the documentary record of this period is thin. What we know is that Charles was not farming. He was working for wages, indoors, managing someone else's establishment. For a man whose identity was built around the open prairie and the independent homestead, hotel work was not a destination. It was a retreat, a necessary one, but a retreat. The family went back to Minnesota in 1877, back to Walnut Grove, a second attempt on ground they had already lost once, and then Mary's eyes started to fail. Here is where the nested ledger makes its first real demand on you as a reader. The grasshopper years had taken the crop. Freddie's death had taken something that doesn't have a name in any account book. The Burr Oak retreat had taken the homestead dream, at least temporarily, and now Mary, studious, steady, rule-following Mary, the daughter who wanted to teach school, who was by every account the academically strongest of the sisters, began to go blind. The timing matters. Not as a moral judgment against Charles Ingalls, but as a structural fact. Mary's illness arrived in a household that had no margin. 3 consecutive crop failures had consumed whatever financial cushion the family might have accumulated. Charles had no savings, no equity, no inheritance to draw against. When illness came, it came into an empty room. The cause of Mary's blindness has been attributed in every edition of the Little House books to scarlet fever. A 2013 study published in the journal Pediatrics, examining the available medical evidence, concluded that the more likely cause was viral meningoencephalitis, a brain infection, sometimes called brain fever, in period sources, that can cause permanent vision loss through damage to the optic nerve. The enrollment registers at the Iowa College for the Blind in Vinton, where Mary was later placed, listed the cause as brain fever. Laura herself, in a 1937 letter to her daughter Rosewalder Lane, first wrote spinal meningitis, then crossed it out and wrote some sort of spinal sickness. She crossed it out. That small moment, a pen drawn through a phrase, an imprecision acknowledged privately and then left uncorrected in the published books, is not a lie exactly. It is a daughter writing about her sister's blindness 50 years after the fact, working from memory, trying to reconstruct something she witnessed as a child and could not fully name. But it is also a gap. And the gap matters, because the gap is where the historical record parts company with the literary one. What is not in dispute? By 1879, Mary Ingalls could not see. She was 14 years old. She had spent the last 5 years in a household that moved, lost, retreated, and moved again. The stability she needed, the settled schooling, the consistent community, the platform from which a young woman of her intelligence might have built something, had been interrupted repeatedly by circumstances her father chose, and circumstances no one could control, and the blur between those two things that the frontier made almost impossible to separate. She would live the next 49 years in the dark. That fact is not romantic. It is not tragic in the literary sense that makes tragedy bearable. It is simply what happened to a girl whose family did not have a barn full of grain to fall back on when everything else failed. The Iowa College for the Blind in Vinton costs money, not a fortune, not the kind of number that would have been insurmountable to a family with capital. But to the Ingalls household in 1881, a family that had survived the hard winter of 1880 to 1881 by eating seed wheat and twisting hay into fuel to heat the house, the ongoing cost of Mary's education in Vinton was not a line item, it was a pressure. Laura Ingalls began teaching school at 15 years old. She was not 15 because she wanted to be a teacher. She was not 15 because the law required it, or because the opportunity was exceptional. The historical record, documented most thoroughly in Carolyn Fraser's Pulitzer Prize-winning biography, Prairie Fires, published in 2017, makes clear that Laura began teaching, at an age and in conditions she later described as genuinely difficult, in significant part because the family needed the money. Specifically, they needed money to help pay for Mary's education. Think about what that means. A 15-year-old girl takes a teaching position in a one-room schoolhouse on the Dakota Prairie, away from her own family, in winter conditions that the same prairie had already proven could kill unprepared people, because her father's series of decisions, however loving, however structurally understandable, had put the family in a position where her wages were not supplemental. They were necessary. The Wilder ledger, at this same moment, looked different. Almanzo Wilder had come to Dakota Territory on his own terms, as a young man from a family that had already given him something the Ingalls family never had, a starting position. The farm in New York had been real capital. Not a dream, not a homestead claim, but deeded land with proven yield, established livestock, and a place in a settled agricultural community. When Almanzo chose to go west, he was choosing adventure from a foundation. When Laura was sent to teach school at 15, she was not choosing anything. She was filling a gap. Both families believed in hard work. Both families lived hard lives. The difference was not character or effort or the willingness to endure. The difference was what happened when the risk went wrong. On the Wilder side, a bad season was a difficulty. The barn still had timber framing overhead. The granary might be lower, but it had walls. The community in Franklin County, New York had deep enough roots that a family could survive a hard year and still be standing in the same place the following spring. On the Ingalls side, a bad season was an emergency, and by 1881 the Ingalls family had had enough bad seasons in sequence that there was no longer a meaningful distinction between temporary hardship and structural poverty. Laura did not write about any of this directly, not in the Little House books. Pioneer Girl, the unpolished pre-literary version of her memory, comes closer, acknowledging the teaching, acknowledging the difficulty, acknowledging some of the economic pressure. But by the time the books were published in the 1930s, the teaching had been transformed into something that could sit alongside Pa's fiddle and Ma's patience, without pulling the whole narrative toward a harder question. The harder question is this. If you close the ledger book that Laura left us, the one with music and courage and the smell of prairie grass after rain, and you open the other one, the one made of census records and homestead filings and school enrollment registers, and the crossed-out word in a private letter to a daughter, what do you find? You find a family that moved at least 12 documented times between 1869 and 1879. You find a man who filed homestead claims on land that the structural conditions of the frontier made nearly impossible to successfully farm. you find a woman who followed him without complaint and arrived in Dakota Territory in 1879 having extracted one promise, that this was the last move. You find an eldest daughter who lost her sight in a household without a financial cushion to catch her. You find a second daughter who began working at 15 to help pay for her blind sister's education. You find a third daughter, Carrie, and a fourth, Grace, growing up in the aftermath of all of it, learning what precarity looks like before they had a word for it. And somewhere in the Walnut Grove dirt in an Iowa churchyard, in a record that Laura chose not to open, you find a small grave. A boy named Freddie, 9 months old, unnamed in all 8 books. Here is what the full barn in New York meant, and here is why it matters now at the end of this chapter, more than it did when it first appeared. The barn was not just a building, it was the difference between a family that could absorb a crisis and a family that could not. When the Wilders had a bad year, they did not have to send a daughter to teach school in a blizzard to keep the lights on somewhere else. They had buffers, they had time, they had the luxury of waiting for the next season. The Ingalls family never had that luxury. Pa was not a reckless man. He was not a bad man. Every account, every letter, every page of Laura's book speaks to a father who loved his daughters with a completeness that left marks. He played the fiddle on nights when there was almost nothing else to give. He told stories that made the cold feel smaller. He was present. In every way a man could be present. In every house they built and left and built again. But the ledger does not lie, and the ledger says, love is not a barn. Love is not a cushion. Love does not keep the wheat from dying, or the eyes from failing, or the youngest daughter from being born in a borrowed hotel room in a town the family was already planning to leave. The next time we look at this ledger, we are going to turn a new page. We are going to go to Dakota Territory, to a winter so severe the railroad stopped running, to a family eating its own seed wheat to survive. We are going to look at the one homestead claim Charles Ingalls actually kept, and we are going to ask what it cost to keep it. Because by the time Pa finally proved up that claim, by the time he handed over $16 at the Brookings Land Office and received the deed to 157 acres, Laura was already a married woman. She had already begun a separate chapter of hardship, with a man who came from the full barn, on land that the Dakota drought would treat no more kindly than it treated everything else. The story is not over. The ledger has more pages. Turn them slowly. There is a specific kind of coal that Dakota Territory produces in October that has nothing to do with temperature. It is the cold of knowing the trains have stopped, of standing at the edge of a town so new it barely has a name yet, looking at a sky that has gone the colour of old tin, and understanding that whatever you have inside your walls right now is what you have until April, maybe May, maybe longer. The Ingalls family arrived into Smet in the autumn of 1879 with what they could carry. Pa had work, timekeeper for the Chicago and Northwestern Railway, the line pushing west across Dakota Territory, and he had land filed on, 157.25 acres, recorded at the Brookings Land Office on February 19th, 1880. He had also made a promise, the most specific promise in the documented record of Charles Ingalls' life. This one, Caroline, the last one. We know he said something close to this because biographers note it, and the fact that he had to say it at all tells you something. You don't promise last unless the person you're promising has been counting. The town of De Smet in 1879 was less a town than a wager. The railroad had not yet fully arrived. The streets were mud and ambition in roughly equal parts. There were a handful of buildings, a surveyor's house the Ingalls would spend that first winter in, and around them, Dakota Prairie running flat to every horizon. The kind of flat that makes the sky feel personal. Pa was 53 years old. He had moved this family across Wisconsin, Kansas, back to Wisconsin, down to Minnesota, sideways to Iowa, back to Minnesota, and now here. Each time the logic was sound. Each time the outcome was not. But here was different. The land records say so. The homestead claim was filed, the residency clock started, and Charles Ingalls set down what felt finally like roots. Then October 1880 arrived, and the sky turned wrong. What the historical record describes about the winter of 1880-1881 in Dakota Territory is not easily absorbed as numbers. Meteorologists classify it as one of the most severe winters in the documented history of the northern plains. But numbers don't tell you what it smells like when you're burning twisted hay because the coal is gone. They don't tell you what a coffee mill sounds like at 4 a.m. when you're grinding seed wheat, the wheat you are supposed to plant in spring, because it's the only grain left in the house. The Chicago and Northwestern Railway stopped running supply trains. Not for a week, not for a month. The coffee mill ran at 4 a.m. grinding seed wheat, the wheat meant for spring planting, because it was the only grain left in the house. The coal was gone, the hay was twisted into sticks and burned. The trains had stopped running, not for a week, not for a month. From October through April, 7 months, de Smet was cut off. Pa had promised this was the last frontier, and the frontier answered. Now here is where you have to sit with something. In Almanzo Wilder's childhood home in upstate New York, the place he had left to come west, the family kept a granary. Not a corner shelf, a granary, a separate structure, purpose-built, filled before winter and still holding when spring came. Not because the Wilders were wealthy in the way the word conjures, but because they had accumulated what the Ingalls family never had, land under them long enough to build one good year on top of another, a cushion between them and the worst that winter could do. Almanzo came west looking for adventure. He said as much. He was 23 years old in 1880, and the Dakota Territory was the kind of open, possible country that a young man from a stable farm family looks at and sees opportunity rather than risk. He did something during the hard winter that made it into the history books. He and a young man named Cap Garland rode out across open, blizzard-scoured prairie to find a settler named Anderson, who reportedly had wheat to sell. Laura later wrote about the ride in the long winter, and local de Smet tradition corroborates the essential story, though what we know of it comes largely through her telling. They came back with wheat, the town ate. Laura later wrote about this in the long winter. She wrote about it as courage, which it was. But ask yourself this. What kind of man can ride out across open prairie during a blizzard in search of another family's grain? A man who grew up in a house where risk was a calculation, not a catastrophe. A man whose family had taught him that a bad situation has a solution if you're willing to ride toward it. Pa Ingalls believed the same thing. The difference, and it was never small, was what they each had waiting if the ride went wrong. The spring came, the trains ran again, de Smet exhaled. The Ingalls family had survived on seed wheat and hay fuel, and whatever community could scrape together for itself. They had survived specifically because multiple families in that small town pulled toward one another, traded labour, shared grain, filled the gaps. Pa wasn't alone in this, but he also wasn't the man who came back from across the prairie with a sleigh full of wheat. He was the man who stayed and waited, because going out on that ride required a particular kind of confidence in your own survival instinct, and Pa Ingalls, by 1880, had been survival tested enough times that confidence had been replaced by something else, something more careful, more quiet. The Long Winter is one of Laura's best books, but even in it, even with her literary instincts at full strength, she softens the grain of what that winter cost. She doesn't write about the seed wheat with the same weight that the fact carries. You're eating next year's planting. You are borrowing against a future that may not arrive. That is not a narrative device. That is the specific economic desperation of a family with no buffer, making a choice that could haunt them for seasons to come. The Wilder granary never went that low. By 1881, the snow was gone and Mary was leaving. Not in the way that daughters usually leave. She wasn't going to a job or a marriage or a new town of her own choosing. She was going to the Iowa College for the Blind in Vinton, enrolled, as the institutional records note, under brain fever as the cause of her condition. And she was going because the family was paying, and the family was paying because Laura was earning. And Laura was earning because at 15 years old she stood up in front of a classroom 12 miles outside of de Smet, in a schoolhouse she later described in Pioneer Girl as the worst she had ever taught in, and collected what the county paid her for the days she lasted. This is the moment the two ledgers stop being parallel and start being the same page. Because while Laura is 12 miles from home in a cold so sharp that the students huddle near the stove and barely learn anything, Almanzo Wilder is in de Smet. He is 25 years old, moderately comfortable, farming his claim, watching the same town. He starts driving Laura home on weekends. At first she doesn't trust it. Pioneer Girl records her suspicion. She asks flatly, whether he's doing it because he wants to court her or because he's simply being polite, because she needs to know before she gets used to the ride. That question is one of the most quietly devastating lines in Laura Ingalls Wilder's entire body of first-person writing. She was 15, possibly 16. She had already been responsible for her family's margin. She had already learned not to take warmth for granted, and when a young man from a full barn started offering her something that felt like security, she needed to know if it was real before she let herself want it. She was not passive in this. That needs to be said. Laura Ingalls did not simply fall into Almanzo Wilder's sleigh and let him carry her toward a better life. She was observant, sceptical, and, by every account her own writing offers, clear-eyed about what marriage on the Dakota Prairie actually meant for a woman. It meant farm work. It meant weather. It meant crop years that could empty a cellar. She had watched her mother live that for 20 years. The question biographers wrestle with, and that Caroline Fraser addresses carefully in Prairie Fires, is the degree to which economic reality shaped what Laura chose. She was 18 years old on August 25, 1885, the day she married Almanzo Wilder, 18. The same age at which, 3 years earlier, she had still been teaching school to help pay for her sister's education in Iowa. The margin between those two facts is the whole shape of her young life. She had been teaching, intermittently, since she was 15. The family still needed her income, and Almanzo Wilder was offering, among other things, a homestead claim of his own, a farm, and the particular stability that comes from a man who grew up knowing how to manage land that didn't fail him. She loved him. The record supports this clearly, but the record also supports the fact that she chose him at an age, and in circumstances where love and necessity were not easily separated, because the frontier had never let them be. It is May 1886. Pa proves up his homestead claim, 157,025 acres, $16 in filing fees, 6 years of residency, blizzard survival, seed wheat winters, and 4 daughters' labour woven into the legal document that finally made the land his. By frontier standards, this was a success. Fewer than 40 to 60% of homestead claims filed on the Great Plains were ever successfully proved up. Historians note figures in that range, though exact rates varied by land district. Charles Ingalls was one of the ones who made it. He had kept his promise. He had stayed. And then the family moved into town. Not dramatically, not in defeat, but practically, into a house on 3rd Street in Smet that Pa built himself, where Caroline would live until her death in 1924, where Mary would live until her death in 1928. The homestead land sat outside town. Pa had proved up the claim and set it aside. He was a carpenter now, a justice of the peace, a county commissioner. The dream of being a farming landowner, the dream that had carried the family from Wisconsin to Kansas to Minnesota to Iowa, and finally here, had transformed into something quieter and more sustainable. Not the frontier mythology, the thing after the frontier mythology. He had stopped moving, but he had not been wrong to worry about what the movement had cost. Open that ledger one more time. The Wilder side, Almanzo arrived in Smet from a family with decades of New York farmland under them. He filed his own Dakota claim in 1880. He proved it up. He had, before Laura, a baseline of stability that made the frontier feel like a choice rather than a necessity. The Ingalls side, Charles arrived in Smet after a Kansas claim that failed, a Minnesota farm that the grasshoppers stripped bare, an Iowa interlude that left no property behind, and a return to Minnesota that offered nothing lasting. He arrived on the margin, filed his claim on the margin, and survived the hard winter by eating what was meant for planting. Both men proved up homesteads in Dakota Territory. Both men stayed through brutal winters. Both men chose the frontier. But choosing a thing from solid ground and choosing it from the edge of a cliff are not the same risk. They only look the same from the outside. Here is what Pa gave to Smet quietly and without asking to be credited. He was one of the men who helped build it. He worked on the earlier structures. He served in local government. He was, by community accounts, a man people liked. Warm, capable, useful. The town that became the Ingalls family's permanent home existed in part because Pa showed up when it was still mostly mud and stayed when it was harder to stay than to leave. That is not a small thing. But the daughters were not abstract civic beneficiaries of their father's community building. They were specific people with specific lives, and the question the record asks, quietly, across census pages and land documents and enrollment registers, is whether the building of de Smet cost them more than it cost him. Mary was 37 years old in 1902 when Pa died. She had been blind for 23 years. She had never married. She had never worked in the way she had once planned to work. She would outlive him by 26 more years, in the same town, in the same house, in the care of her surviving family. 26 years. That is not a footnote to Pa's story. That is life. And Laura, married to Almanzo, living in Mansfield, Missouri by 1902, because the years after their wedding had not gone according to any plan either of them had made. She was 35 years old. She'd already lived through diphtheria that left Almanzo partially paralyzed in one leg. She had already lost a baby whose name is almost entirely absent from the historical record. She had already watched a fire take their farmhouse in 1889. She had already moved to Florida briefly, chasing something better, before landing in Missouri. The same pattern, a smaller scale, her father's instinct alive in her own feet. And Pa was gone. Pioneer Girl, drafted years later, lets you see the arithmetic of what she was carrying when she finally sat down to write about her childhood. She was 63 years old. Her mother had been dead for 11 years. Mary had been dead for 3, and she wrote the most beloved children's book series in American literature about a man who played the fiddle and moved toward every horizon with a smile. She kept what she needed to keep. She gave the world the warmth. She left the rest in the place where daughters keep what they never quite say. She thought she had gotten out. That's the part that makes this hard to sit with. Laura Ingalls had watched her father chase one horizon after another her entire childhood, and she had quietly, methodically done everything a young woman on the Dakota Prairie could do to ensure her own story ended differently. She took the teaching jobs. She said yes to the man who came from a family that knew how to keep a barn full. She made a calculation, and it was the right calculation given everything she knew, but the land had one more lesson left. The summers after their wedding were not the ones Laura planned for. Almanzo's homestead claim in Dakota was good land, better positioned than many, biographers note, because he had arrived early enough to file on a quarter section with reasonable soil and water access. The first years looked like what she had hoped for: a house going up, a farm taking shape, a future that had edges and a floor. Then 1886 arrived, then 1887, then 1888. 3 drought years, back to back, across the Dakota Territory, the same pattern meteorologists now recognize as a recurring feature of the Northern Plains climate cycle. Not unusual, not a fluke. The land doing what the land had always done, which the promotional brochures for Dakota homesteading had never quite gotten around to mentioning. The wheat came up thin, then it didn't come up at all. The wilders had planted, hoped and waited, and what came back was cracked soil and still air, and the particular silence of a field that has given up. This is the moment the second ledger opens. Because here is what the drought revealed about the difference between the two families' starting positions, not as a comparison to relitigate, but as a consequence that was now landing on Laura's specific life. Almanzo Wilder, on his own Dakota claim, without the deep New York family farm behind him as a daily operating cushion, was financially exposed in exactly the way Pa Ingalls had always been. The buffer his family of origin provided was structural. It belonged to that farm in that place, with that accumulated time beneath it. He had brought his skills and his confidence west. He had not brought the granary. 3 drought years erased what the first 2 good years had built, and then the illness came. In the winter of 1888, Almanzo contracted diphtheria. He nearly died. He recovered, but incompletely, in the way that 19th century recoveries from serious illness often meant a body that worked differently afterward than it had before. He was left with partial paralysis in his legs, documented by biographers and confirmed through Laura's own letters. He would walk for the rest of his life with a noticeable difficulty. He would never again work on a farm at full physical capacity. Laura was 21 years old. She had a husband who could no longer do what a Dakota homestead required a man to do. 3 years of failed crops behind her, a newborn daughter named Rose, born December 5, 1886, and a farm that was not paying its own debts. The record for this period is thin in places, and we should say so plainly. But what we do know is that Laura was holding more than she should have been holding, at an age when most of the women she knew were still figuring out the shape of their married lives. And then they lost a baby, a son born in August 1889 who lived only a few days. Laura did not give him a name in the surviving record, or if she did, it was not preserved in the sources historians have been able to verify. He appears in Pioneer Girl as a brief, terrible absence. He appears in the scholarly literature as a notation. He does not appear in the Little House books at all. She had watched her mother do this. Carry a loss quietly. Keep moving. Not because she was numb, but because the alternative, stopping to hold it, letting it become the shape of everything, was not an option the frontier gave you. This is what that childhood had trained her for. The specific, terrible skill of surviving the thing and then getting up and doing the next thing. 3 months after losing the baby, a fire took their farmhouse. The fire was in 1889. The cause is not clearly documented in every account, but the fact is consistent across sources. The house they had built burned. What they had constructed, the physical shelter of their life together, was gone. They moved into a smaller place. Then the drought continued. Then the debt mounted in the way that frontier debt mounted. Not dramatically, but steadily, the way water rises in a low room. By 1891, Almanzo and Laura Wilder had made a decision that Pa Ingalls would have recognised instantly. They were leaving. They went to Spring Valley, Minnesota first, to Almanzo's family, the people with roots and land, and stayed for a time while Almanzo tried to recover more fully. Then they went further, to Westville, Florida in 1891, chasing a warmer climate for Almanzo's health, the same logic that had sent thousands of struggling Midwesterners south in that era. The Florida land was cheap. The Florida winters were survivable for a man whose legs didn't always cooperate in cold. It made sense. It didn't work. Carolyn Fraser's Prairie Fires notes that the Florida venture lasted approximately a year before the Wilders returned north. The land was too different from what they knew. The farming conditions were unfamiliar. The community wasn't theirs. Laura, by her own account in letters, was miserable. This is Pa's pattern, lived in miniature. Different geography, different names on the documents, the same fundamental arithmetic. A family moving toward a better horizon, and finding the horizon kept moving too. What comes next is the moment that changes everything, but it doesn't feel like that yet. In 1894, Almanzo and Laura Wilder packed a covered wagon and drove south from Smet toward Mansfield, Missouri. Rose was 7 years old. The journey took roughly 6 weeks, documented in Laura's diary from that summer, the same diary eventually published as On the Way Home, and it is, in its spare practical entries, one of the most quietly devastating documents in the entire Ingalls-Wilder record. Because Laura was 37 in 1894, she had been married for 9 years. She had lived in Dakota, Minnesota, Florida, and briefly back in Smet. She had lost a child. She had watched her husband's body fail him. She had watched 3 years of drought strip the land bare, and here she was in a covered wagon, headed for another place, writing down the temperature and the miles and the price of corn in the towns they passed through. Not the emotion, the logistics, the same handwriting her mother had taught her, the same control. Rocky Ridge Farm outside Mansfield, Missouri, was 40 acres of Ozark hillside that Almanzo and Laura bought for the equivalent of what the land cost at that moment. Not much, because it was rough land, rocky and timbered, nothing like the flat Dakota fields. But it was theirs, purchased outright, and within a decade they had built something that the Dakota years had never quite managed to produce. A farm that stayed. It was not easy. It was never easy. The early Mansfield years were tight enough that Laura took a job writing for the Missouri Ruralist newspaper, the beginnings of the writing career that would eventually produce the Little House books, not as a creative ambition, but as a way to supplement Almanzo's farming income. Do you notice the pattern? She picked up work when the margin narrowed, exactly as she had done at 15. Different jobs, different decade, same mathematics. Charles Ingalls died on June 8, 1902, in Smet, South Dakota, heart failure. He was 66 years old. Laura was in Missouri. She had been in Mansfield for 8 years by then. Pa never visited Rocky Ridge Farm. The distances of the frontier were not just geographic. They were the accumulated miles of every move, compressed into the fact that a father and his daughter ended up living lives that didn't overlap the way they might have if either of them had stayed in one place long enough for the other to find them easily. He died in the house on 3rd Street he had built himself, in the town he had helped found, with Caroline beside him. He had proved up his homestead. He had served his community. He had stopped moving eventually, but the daughters were scattered now. Mary in the same house, Carrie in the Black Hills working for a newspaper, Grace on a farm near Manchester with her husband Nathan Dow, Laura in Missouri. The restlessness had carried all of them away from each other, and even at the end there was no single place where they all landed together. The ledger. Open it one last time. On the wilder side, Almanzo's partial paralysis, the drought years, the fire, the Florida failure, the Rocky Ridge purchase. These are not small difficulties. By the measure of raw hardship, his adult life in the years after marriage was genuinely brutal. He's not a cartoon of comfort. He worked on that Mansfield hillside for decades, with a body that didn't fully cooperate, and he built something there that endured. But ask the question the ledger always asks. What was his baseline when the worst began? He came to the frontier from a family with land and time and a filled granary. He came with the psychological formation of a man who had learned, growing up, that hard work produces outcomes. Because it had. For him. In that place. With that land underneath him. When the Dakota drought hit, it hit a man who had known what good years felt like, who had a family of origin to retreat to in Minnesota, who had the physical and psychological vocabulary of recovery rather than just survival. Pa Ingalls came to every frontier with the vocabulary of try again, and he did. Every time. The difference is not courage. Both men had that. The difference is what they were trying from. In 1930, Laura Ingalls Wilder sat down in the farmhouse at Rocky Ridge and began writing the document that would become Pioneer Girl, the unfiltered autobiography she would eventually reshape into children's books. She was 63 years old. Pa had been dead for 28 years. The Dakota Prairie she'd grown up on had long since lost its frontier status. The Homestead Act itself would be repealed in 1976 for the contiguous states, the legal framework that had driven her father's entire adult life, already obsolete in her own lifetime. She wrote about the fiddle. She wrote about the warmth of the fire. She wrote about Pa singing in the evenings when everything else was thin, and about the way his presence in a room made a room feel like enough. She did not write about the debt structure. She did not write about the seed wheat they ate. She did not write about the baby whose name the record does not clearly preserve. She wrote the version that a daughter writes when she has survived everything she survived and still needs the man who taught her how to be brave to have been worth it. That is not dishonesty. That is what love does with the ledger when the numbers are too hard to read out loud. There is one more thing. Rose Wilder Lane, born on that Dakota claim in December 1886, grew up on Rocky Ridge with parents who were perpetually scraping the margin together. She became a journalist, a novelist, a political writer of considerable influence, one of the founders, historians note, of modern American libertarianism. She also, for years, supplemented her parents' income at Rocky Ridge with money she sent from her own career, because the farm that never failed them was still, even in their 60s, not always enough. She left. She travelled. She lived in Albania, Baghdad, New York, San Francisco, and eventually a farmhouse in Connecticut. She never stayed anywhere for very long. She's not the subject of this documentary, but you should know she existed, and you should know what she inherited. Not property, not land, not a granary full against the winter. She inherited the instinct to move. The barn the Wilders of New York kept full against the cold is still the symbol this story needed, not because it represents everything wrong with the American frontier myth, but because it represents everything unequal about the way we've always told it. 2 families, 2 sets of hard work, 2 genuine stories of courage and love. One family had a flaw, the other had Pa's fiddle, and the daughter who grew up with the fiddle sat down at 63 years old and wrote the most beloved American childhood in the literary canon. From a farmhouse she had fought for, on land she had earned in the years after every single thing the frontier had tried to take from her. She left out the hardest parts, but she kept every note of the music. Nobody asked Carrie. That is the quiet fact that sits underneath everything Laura ever wrote. Nobody asked Caroline Celestia Ingalls, Carrie, the third daughter, born during the Kansas Territory years, the child who grew up in the shadow of Mary's blindness and Laura's brilliance. What she remembered about Pa. Nobody asked what she thought moving 12 times before she was 10 had cost her. Nobody asked Grace, the youngest, who was born in Iowa and spent her adult life farming South Dakota land not so different from the land that had broken her father. And Mary, who outlived Pa by 26 years and sat in the 3rd Street house in Smet through decade after decade, she couldn't write her version down, and even if she could have, nobody was waiting to publish it. The Little House books are Laura's books, which means they are Laura's memory, Laura's selection, and ultimately Laura's survival strategy for making sense of a childhood that, examined without the warmth of her prose, was genuinely hard. But there were 4 daughters. When Charles Ingalls died in June 1902, the 3rd Street house in Smet held 2 women who would spend the rest of their lives there. Carolyn, Ma, lived until April 1924. She was 84 years old at her death, and she had been in Smet for over 40 years, longer than she had lived anywhere else in her life. That permanence, the thing she had wanted from the beginning and asked for explicitly before the Dakota move, arrived in the form of a frame house on a South Dakota town lot. Not the farm she'd perhaps once imagined, but a house that didn't move, in a community that knew her name. Mary lived there with her. Think about that for a moment. Mary Ingalls was 19 when she lost her sight, went to the Iowa school in Vinton, studied and graduated and came home. She was a graduate, she read Braille, she spoke French, she had skills and education, and she came back to the 3rd Street house, where she would stay for the rest of her life, 50 years of it, dependent, unmarried, and quiet in every historical record that survives her. She died in October 1928. She had outlived Pa by 26 years and her mother by 4. She was 63 years old. She never left Smet again. The absence of Mary's voice in this story is not accidental, and it is not just tragic. It is structural. Mary Ingalls had no mechanism by which her version of Pa could reach a reading public. She was blind. She had no income independent of the family. She had no daughter who would become a famous author. She existed in the historical record primarily as a notation in other people's accounts. Laura's books, the Iowa School Register, the Smet census, her death certificate. Her inner life, what she thought about the moves, what she felt about the decades spent in that house while the world moved on around her. That record is nearly empty. What we know is this. The Smet School Register at Vinton listed her cause of blindness as brain fever. What we know is that she arrived at that school at 16, having already watched 2 families' worth of frontier hardship, and that she studied there for 7 years. What we know is that when she came home to Smet, the house she came home to was the one Pa had built, the most permanent structure he ever completed, the one that didn't burn, didn't get abandoned, didn't need to be left behind. The cruelest geography in this whole story may be that Mary Ingalls, the daughter who most needed roots, spent her life in the one place the family finally stayed, unable to leave it, unable to see it, unable to write it down. Carrie went in a different direction. Caroline Celestia Ingalls Swansea. She would eventually marry David Swansea in 1912, at 41 years old, spent the decades between Pa's death and her own marriage working as a typesetter and journalist in the South Dakota Black Hills region. She worked for newspapers in Deadwood and Hot Springs. She was, in the language of that era, a working woman, not wealthy, not comfortable in the way the books might imply, but professionally present and independently documented in a way that Grace and Mary were not. Caroline Fraser's Prairie Fires notes that Carrie was among the least mythologized of the Ingalls daughters, which is another way of saying she was the one who most escaped the gravitational pull of Laura's narrative. She had her own professional life. She had her own byline. She had, in a small but documented way, her own version of what the frontier gave her. Not wealth, not ease, but the specific competence of a woman who learned early that the margin was thin and that you worked in it. Carrie died in Rapid City in June 1946. She was 75 years old. The obituaries were brief. And then there is Grace. Grace Pearl Ingalls Dow was born in Burr Oak, Iowa in 1877, the year before the family returned to Walnut Grove and 2 years before the Dakota move. She was the youngest surviving sibling. She married Nathan Dow in 1901, a year before Pa died, and moved to a farm near Manchester, South Dakota, a few dozen miles from Smet, close enough to the family home to stay in the orbit, far enough to build a separate life. The historical record on Grace is thin in places where historians cannot fully recover, and we should say so plainly. What we know is that she farmed. She married a farmer. She lived and died on South Dakota plains land. The same kind of terrain, the same climatic vulnerabilities, the same weather patterns that had broken her father's finances repeatedly. She died in November 1941. She did not write a book about it. This is not a small point. Grace Ingalls grew up on the same prairie, ate the same seed wheat during the same hard winters, watched the same sky for rain that never came. And then she went and lived that life again, on purpose, or at least without a different option presenting itself clearly enough to choose it. What the frontier gave Pa's daughters, in the end, was not freedom. It was fluency, a specific, unsentimental literacy in hard things that had no market value and generated no royalties, unless your name was Laura. Here is the thing about Pioneer Girl that doesn't get said often enough. Laura Ingalls Wilder wrote it in 1930 in her 60s, on a farm that was finally stable, and she wrote it raw. Not polished, not curated for children, not softened by the editorial instinct that would eventually produce the Little House series. Pioneer Girl, the original manuscript she typed at Rocky Ridge and sent to her daughter Rose, includes the baby boy who died unnamed in Dakota. It includes the violence and the fear that the published books reduced to manageable tension. It includes the Burr Oak Saloon, where Charles worked briefly managing a hotel that shared space with a rougher establishment below, a detail carefully removed from the children's books. It includes Laura's own admission that she asked Almanzo Wilder point blank whether he was courting her or just being polite, in language that sounds less like a girl with a crush and more like a young woman performing basic financial due diligence. Pioneer Girl was rejected by publishers, not because it was poorly written, because it was too honest for the market. Laura's first literary agent at the time passed on it, suggesting instead that she tried to turn the material into something for younger readers. And so, she did, and the process of turning Pioneer Girl into children's books was also, necessarily, the process of turning the historical Charles Ingalls into the Pa that most of the world has known ever since. What came out of that revision was not a lie, but it was a selection, and selections have costs. Think about what specifically didn't make it from Pioneer Girl into the published series. The Burr Oak period, the Iowa years, appears in Pioneer Girl but was almost entirely removed from the published books. The family lived in Burr Oak from 1876 to 1877, and it was a genuinely difficult period. Charles was managing a hotel and doing whatever work was available. The family was not farming. The situation was urban and cramped in a way that contradicted the prairie freedom narrative. Baby Freddie died during this period or just before. These were the months the family spent retreating from the grasshopper disaster, not advancing toward the horizon. Laura cut it. The published Little House series jumps from Minnesota to Dakota without the Iowa years appearing at all. That cut is not a small editorial decision. It removes the period of greatest retreat, greatest defeat, greatest urban dependence, the period that looks most like failure in the conventional sense. If the books are Pa's monument, the Iowa years are the section of the wall where the mortar didn't hold. Laura Tuck pointed over it, and the surface came out smooth. She loved him. You can feel it in every word she ever wrote about him. And she protected that love by protecting his image. This is where the ledger and the literature diverge most sharply. The ledger, the census records, the land office filings, the newspaper accounts, the school registers, the death certificates, shows a family that moved constantly, struggled financially, lost children and crops and claims, and absorbed those losses in the bodies and lives of the people who had no say in the next departure date. The literature shows a family whose hardships were always temporary, whose father always knew a song for the darkness, whose love was always exactly sufficient to make the privation feel like adventure. Both of these things are true accounts of the same life. That is the hardest thing about this story. Laura did not invent Pa's warmth. It was real. The fiddle was real. The singing in difficult winters was real. The love between that father and those daughters was, by every account, one of the most genuine things in all of it. Caroline Fraser, who spends much of Prairie Fires documenting Charles Ingalls' financial failures and the genuine hardship they caused, also notes that the Ingalls household had a quality of warmth and literacy and music that was genuinely uncommon on the frontier. Pa was not a myth because Laura invented qualities he didn't have. He was a myth because Laura omitted the dimensions of his life that complicated the qualities he did have. That is a different kind of untruth. It is the kind you tell when you love someone more than you love the record. The question the outline asks, the question this whole documentary has been quietly building toward, is not did Pa fail his daughters? It is more uncomfortable than that. The question is, what does it mean that the daughter who could write chose not to write the whole thing? Because Laura Ingalls Wilder was not a naive memoirist who simply forgot the hard parts. She was a 60-year-old woman with a full adult experience of frontier precarity when she sat down at that typewriter. She had lived the drought years in Dakota. She had buried a son. She had watched a farmhouse burn. She had followed her husband to Florida and back. She had driven a wagon to Missouri at 37 and scratched a farm out of Ozark hillside with her own hands. She knew, better than almost anyone, precisely what frontier life cost. She chose to write Little House in the Big Woods anyway. She chose to write the Wisconsin years, the earliest, most settled, most secure period of her childhood, as the opening of her literary memoir of childhood. She chose to begin the story when it was still warm. That choice tells you everything about what the story cost to live and what it cost to survive. Mary Ingalls died in 1928. She left no writing. Grace Ingalls Dow died in 1941, 2 years before Laura published these happy golden years, the last of the original Little House series. Grace does not appear in the public record as having read the books, though she certainly knew of them. She had watched her sister become famous for a version of their childhood. She lived 10 more miles from Smet, on a farm, in a life the books had not preserved. Carrie Ingalls Swansea outlived them all except Laura. She died in 1946, having spent decades in the Black Hills working in journalism. She had seen more of the actual frontier, its newsrooms, its mining towns, its rough civic life, than the books ever showed. She carried her own ledger. None of them left a competing account. That silence is not proof that they agreed with Laura's version. It is proof that only one of them had a publisher. And here is the cliffhanger that the ledger leaves open, the thing the books almost said but never quite did. When Laura finished these happy golden years in 1943, the Little House series ended with her wedding. It ended with the beginning of the story we covered in Chapter 4, the homestead, the drought, Almanzo's illness, the fire, the covered wagon to Missouri. All of that, everything that happened after the last page, is the part Laura chose not to write. She wrote her childhood. She did not write what her childhood prepared her for. The books stop at the church door. They stop at the moment just before the pattern reasserts itself, before the drought hits and the baby dies and the house burns and the wagon gets packed again. They stop exactly where they need to stop, if what you're doing is protecting the myth, which means the most revealing moment in the entire Little House corpus is not what Laura wrote. It is the page she never turned. Rose Wilder Lane was 44 years old when her mother sent her that first manuscript. She had already lived more lives than most people manage in one. She had been a telegraph operator in Kansas City, a real estate promoter in California, a foreign correspondent in post-war Europe, a biographer of Henry Ford and Herbert Hoover, a novelist who once had a genuine bestseller. She had lived in Albania. She had reported from the famine zones of Georgia in the early Soviet years. She had seen, up close, what happens to people when a centralized government controls the land, the food, and the freedom to move. She came home from that, and she was not the same woman who had left. By 1930, Rose Wilder Lane had become something with a name and a political framework. She was one of the founding architects of what we now call modern American libertarianism. Not metaphorically, literally. Scholars of American political thought, William Holtz's biography of Rose, published in 1993, is the foundational text here. Place her alongside Albert J. Nock and Isabel Patterson, as one of the three intellectual mothers of the American libertarian movement. She believed, with the ferocity of someone who had watched collectivism function in practice, that individual freedom was the only moral foundation for a society, that government dependency was a form of slow destruction, and that the American pioneer, the self-reliant settler who built something from nothing on open land, was the most powerful living argument for everything she believed. And then her mother sent her a manuscript full of pioneer settlers. This is not a conspiracy. It is something more interesting and more complicated than that. Laura Ingalls Wilder was not a passive writer waiting for her daughter to tell her what to say. She was 63 years old, had been a working journalist in Mansfield for decades, and had strong opinions about how her own life should be told. Her correspondence with Rose, stored at the Herbert Hoover Presidential Library in West Branch, Iowa, shows two strong-willed women who both wanted the books to be what they became, and who disagreed, sometimes sharply, about specific passages and emphasis. This was a collaboration, not a dictation. The books are Laura's books, but collaboration means both parties leave fingerprints. Rose's editorial involvement in the Little House series was substantial and is documented. William Holtz, in The Ghost in the Little House, goes the furthest in arguing that Rose's rewrites constituted near co-authorship on some volumes, a claim that other scholars, including Johnny Miller and Caroline Fraser, consider overstated. Fraser's position in Prairie Fires, which is the more carefully calibrated one, is that Rose was a major editorial influence whose contributions shaped the book's structure, prose style, and political subtext, but that the emotional and biographical core of the series was Laura's and remained Laura's. The debate over credit is real, but it is not the most important thing about it. The most important thing is what Rose brought to those manuscripts when she read them. A political lens that made Pa Ingalls into something he had never quite been in real life. Think about what Pa looked like through Rose's eyes. Rose had grown up in that farmhouse. She knew the real version, the droughts, the failed crops, the mortgage years, the fear that sat under everything. She had left Rocky Ridge at 16 and never really settled anywhere again. She had spent her entire adult life running from something she couldn't name, accumulating and losing money, living brilliantly and sometimes desperately. She had what later biographers would describe carefully as a pattern of emotional and financial cycles that bore the mark of someone who grew up in a household where the margin was always thin and stability was always provisional. She had inherited the anxiety, in other words. She just didn't write children's books about it. What she did instead was build an ideology that made the anxiety mean something. If self-reliance was the supreme human virtue, then a childhood defined by precarity was not trauma, it was training. If government dependency was the deepest form of corruption, then the fact that her family had survived on almost nothing without institutional help was not evidence of abandonment, it was evidence of American greatness. And if the pioneer father who moved his family across the frontier, chasing land and freedom, was the moral hero of American history, then Pa Ingalls, the fiddle-playing optimist who never stayed anywhere long enough to go broke without eventually moving on, was exactly the symbol Rose needed. The books did not falsify this. They selected it. They took the parts of Charles Ingalls that fit the argument and built a monument from them. Here is the ledger detail that you almost never hear. The land Pa claimed in Dakota Territory, the 157.25 acres he proved up in May 1886, was only available to him because of the federal government. The Homestead Act of 1862 was a piece of legislation. It was a government program. It was Washington, D.C. deciding that public land should be distributed to individual settlers at minimal cost because that was the political and economic project of the era. Without that act, without that federal intervention, Pa Ingalls had no Dakota homestead. He had no claim. He has no story. The independence the book celebrated was built on a government land grant. This is not an attack. It is a historical fact that the ideological framework Rose brought to those manuscripts was, quietly, in tension with the very story the manuscripts told. The pioneer myth of pure self-reliance, the man who needed nothing from anyone, who built his life from the raw materials of will and labour alone, was not precisely the life the ledger recorded. The ledger recorded a man who used every federal program available to him, who relied on his daughter's wages during the hardest years, who accepted community help during the long winter in ways the book softened considerably, and who never quite achieved the independence the myth implied. Rose knew this, she had lived it, and she chose, with her mother, to write the other version. And that choice was not dishonest in a simple way, it was protective in a specific way. Because here is the thing about the government land grant and the question of self-reliance. For a man like Pa, in that era, on that frontier, the question was not did he use government programs. Every settler used the Homestead Act. Everyone moved on federal land. The programs were the given context, not the exception. The real question was what you did with the opportunity once the government provided it. And what Pa did, in the books and in real life, was work, hard, without complaint, through conditions that would break most modern adults in a week. So, the books were not lying about his character. They were doing what Rose, with her political instincts, understood was necessary to protect the argument. They were removing the structural scaffolding and leaving only the man. Strip away the federal land grant, the community assistance, the daughter's wages, and what you have left is a pioneer who built something from nothing, which is exactly the symbol the libertarian origin story needs. And it is also, right there, the precise place where the historical record and the literary record stop telling the same story. There is a specific moment in Laura's letters to Rose, documented in Prairie Fires, where Laura pushed back on Rose's tendency to edit toward a more overtly philosophical message. Laura understood that the books needed to feel like memory, not argument. She was right about that. The genius of the Little House series is that it doesn't feel like a political manifesto. It feels like a grandmother telling you what her childhood was like. The ideology is embedded, not stated. The argument is made through images. The full pantry, the snug house, the family that needs nothing but itself and Pa's fiddle, rather than through declaration. This is why the books work so well for so long, and it is also why they are worth looking at carefully now, because when you look at the full family record, the Ingalls side and the Wilder side together, you see that the pantry was not always full, the house was not always snug, the family needed more than itself, and the fiddle, as beautiful as it was in the dark, did not keep the crops from failing, or the baby from dying, or the mortgage from coming due. With the words the books use again and again is enough. Pa always has enough. The food is enough. The hay is enough. The wood is enough. There is always just enough. And the books offer this nearness to the edge as a kind of grace, a reminder of what sufficiency feels like when you've been scared you won't have it. It is one of Laura's most delicate literary choices, and it works because it is emotionally true. There were years when they had enough. There were winters when they survived. The books collect those moments and hold them up. What the books quietly omit is the count. They don't tell you how many times enough was not the word for it. How many springs arrived after a winter when the margin was not enough but barely. How many times the family reached the far side of a hard season, not because the plan worked, but because the daughters worked, or because a neighbour came through, or because the federal program provided the land to begin with. The books give you the surviving. They don't give you the full accounting of what surviving cost. Wags, now here is what Rose did after the Little House books were published and became the most beloved children's series in America. She took the philosophy that was embedded in them, the self-reliance, the pioneer individualism, the rejection of government dependency, and she wrote it out plainly in her 1943 essay, The Discovery of Freedom. That essay, along with Ayn Rand's The Fountainhead published the same year, and Isabel Patterson's The God of the Machine, is considered one of the three founding texts of the American libertarian movement by historians of political philosophy. Rose Wilder Lane's primary rhetorical exhibit for human freedom was the American pioneer. Her primary exhibit for the American pioneer was her own family. Her primary source for her own family was her mother's books, which were edited in part by Rose. This is not a circle of deceit. It is a circle of belief. Rose genuinely believed what she was writing. Laura genuinely believed what she remembered. Neither of them fabricated their love for Charles Ingalls or their conviction that the frontier had made them who they were. But by the time Rose finished writing The Discovery of Freedom, the historical Pa Ingalls, the man who moved 12 times, failed multiple homestead claims, depended on his daughter's wages, and built his final permanent house with lumber bought on credit, had been fully transformed into the symbolic American pioneer. The man who needed government land to survive had become the argument against government assistance. The ledger had been closed. The balance had been struck in someone else's favour. This is the callback the barn has been waiting for. We have come a long way from that Wilder barn in upstate New York, the one that was full going into winter, the one with the second team of horses, the one that represented a safety net Pa Ingalls never had. We have watched the Ingalls family move through Kansas and Minnesota and Iowa and Dakota, building and losing and building again, and we have watched the books transform that cycle into a testament to American resilience. But here is what the barn actually meant, in the context of everything Rose and Laura built together. The Wilder barn was proof that the pioneer myth worked. For some families, the families who started with good land, established capital, and community roots. The families who had something to fall back on when the risk went wrong. The Wilder barn was not a symbol of self-reliance achieved from nothing. It was a symbol of self-reliance built on top of something that was already there. Pa never had that foundation. And the books, which celebrate his resilience so beautifully and so honestly also, quietly, without stating it, accept the premise that he was building from the same starting line as everyone else. He wasn't. And yet, there is something Laura understood about her father that the historical record, examined coldly, sometimes misses. Charles Ingalls was not only the sum of his failures, he was also genuinely a man who gave his daughters something the ledger cannot quantify. Not just warmth and music, though those were real. He gave them a relationship to the physical world, to weather and land and animals and seasons, that was direct and unmediated in a way that would define what they could do with difficulty for the rest of their lives. Laura Ingalls Wilder drove that wagon to Missouri at 37 and built a farm from Ozark Hillside, not because her father was a financial success, but because he had raised her in conditions where a person either learns the land or suffers the land, and she had learned it. The thing Pa gave his daughters was not security. He couldn't give them that. He gave them fluency, a specific bodily, lifelong fluency in hard things. Whether that gift was worth the cost of what it took to give it is not a question the historical record can answer. It is a question each of his daughters answered privately, in the way they chose to live or not live after he was gone. Laura answered it in the books. She answered it by writing Pa as the man she needed him to be, which was also, in important ways, the man he actually was, minus the parts that complicated the warmth. She answered it by building a myth that has now outlasted every census record, every land office filing, every mortgage document, every failed crop report. She answered it by ensuring that what most people know about Charles Ingalls is the fiddle, and the fire, and the courage, not the debts, not the moves, not the daughters whose wages kept the household alive. She answered it with love, and love, as anyone who has ever read those books knows, is not a neutral act. Love selects, love protects, love keeps the ledger, and then decides which numbers to show. The books were published between 1932 and 1943. By 1943, Pa had been dead for 41 years. Ma had been dead for 19. Mary was gone. Grace would die that November. The frontier that shaped all of them had become mythology, textbook, and curriculum. American schoolchildren were reading Little House on the Prairie as though it were a transparent window onto history. It was a window, but it was also, always, a frame. And the frame was built by a woman who loved her father more than she loved the record, in collaboration with a daughter who had turned her own inheritance, the anxiety, the instability, the knowledge of what precarity feels like from the inside, into the most coherent political philosophy she could find to make it mean something. Both of them were trying to survive what Pa's choices had given them. One of them did it with a typewriter, the other did it with an ideology, and the result was the same. A version of Pa that the world accepted as true, built on top of a reality that the world was never quite shown. Which brings us to the question the documentary has been saving, the one that waits at the bottom of every ledger page we've turned through these 6 chapters. Charles Ingalls died in Smet on June 8, 1902, at 66 years old of heart failure. He died in the house on 3rd Street, the frame house he built himself, the one he finally kept, the one that didn't burn or get abandoned. He had proved up his homestead. He had served as justice of the Peace and County Commissioner. He had raised 4 daughters who survived to adulthood, one of whom would eventually become the most widely read American children's author of the 20th century. By some measures, he got there. By the measures his daughters lived, the wages Laura earned at 15, the blind years Mary absorbed on that 3rd Street couch, the farms Grace and Carrie worked without ever becoming famous for working them, the accounting is more complicated. The question this documentary asked at the very beginning was quiet and hard. Can a loving father still fail his children by chasing hope too many times? 6 chapters in, we have the evidence. What we don't have yet, what the final chapter will sit with, is the verdict. And the verdict, it turns out, depends entirely on whose ledger you're reading from. There is a farmhouse in the Ozarks that Laura Ingalls Wilder built with her own hands. Not metaphorically, literally. She and Almanzo drove nails into those walls themselves, hauled stone, planted the apple orchard, dug in when the land resisted them. They called it Rocky Ridge Farm. They were 47 years old before the house was finally what they meant it to be. 47 years old. Pa had already been dead for 3 years by then. He never saw it finished. He never stood in its doorway. That matters. Hold on to it. Because there is a version of this story, the version most of us grew up with, the version that lives in the spines of 8 well-worn books, where the farmhouse at Rocky Ridge is the logical ending. Hard work rewarded, grit confirmed. The frontier promised something, and eventually it delivered. Pa's fiddle played in the dark, the family moved west, they survived, and one day his daughter built something solid. That version is not wrong. It is just not the whole ledger. When Pa died on June 8, 1902, in Smet, South Dakota, his estate was modest. The house on 3rd Street, the one he had spent years building with his own carpenter's hands, construction beginning in 1887 and finishing in 1889, passed to Caroline. There was property, modest savings, the accumulated dignity of a man who had served as Justice of the Peace and County Commissioner and neighbour. By frontier standards, it was not nothing. By any other standard, it was the inheritance of a man who had worked his entire adult life and arrived, at the end, without capital to pass forward. His daughters received no land, no farm, no bank account that would cushion the next bad year. What they received was harder to measure, and in the long run far more consequential. They received a specific kind of knowledge of how to survive when the thing you built falls down, knowledge of how to move forward when the ground gives out, knowledge of what human beings are actually made of when warmth and music are the only resources left. Pa gave them that. It is real. It is documented in every line his daughter later wrote. But it is worth asking, quietly and without accusation, what else they needed that knowledge could not replace. Mary was 37 when Pa died. She had been blind for 23 years. She had lived at the family home in Smet since returning from the Iowa College for the Blind in Vinton, reading Braille, attending the Presbyterian Church, maintaining what contemporary accounts describe consistently as a kind of quiet grace under circumstances that would have broken a great many people. What the historical record cannot give us is Mary's own voice about any of it. There is no surviving diary, no letters that historians have located, no memoir, no recorded reflections, no document in which Mary Ingalls speaks directly about what her life meant to her, what she wished had been different, what she found beautiful in the 50 years she spent navigating a world she could not see. That silence is not incidental. It is the most significant single gap in the entire Ingalls archive. Mary lived longer after Pa's death than some of her sisters lived total. She outlasted him by 26 years, dying in October 1928 at 63 years old. 26 years of Braille books, of church socials, of South Dakota winters inside the 3rd Street house, while the rest of the world changed around her. We do not know what she thought. We can only document what she had, and what she had for the last 2.5 decades of her life was dependency. Quiet, dignified, loving dependency on her mother and her sisters, in a house that Pa had built and Pa had left behind. That is not a verdict. It is a fact. And in a documentary asking honest questions about what Pa's choices cost the people who loved him, Mary's story is the cost that cannot be softened or narrativized into something easier to hold. She is the daughter the little house books, across 8 volumes, could never quite bring themselves to show you fully. Not because Laura didn't love her, because showing Mary fully would have required showing what the frontier actually did to the families who lived it without a safety net. Carrie found another way. Caroline Celestia Ingalls, the middle daughter, born during the Indian Territory period in 1870, became a typesetter, then a reporter, then an editor. She spent her adult professional life working for newspapers across the Black Hills region of South Dakota, building something with language the way her father had tried to build something with land claims and carpentry. She married Frank Swansea in 1912, later than most women of her generation, and moved to Rapid City. She wrote, she worked, she built a public life out of sentences, which is the kind of building that doesn't require 160 acres, or a good growing season, or a claim that survives the hard winter. Carrie represents something the frontier mythology tends to overlook, the daughter who found independence not by inheriting stability, but by creating a different kind of flaw altogether. She didn't own land, she owned a craft. Whether Pa's restlessness gave her that or cost her the path to something easier, the record doesn't say clearly. What it does say is that of the 4 surviving Ingalls daughters, Carrie is the one who most visibly built a professional identity out of her own labour rather than marriage or family dependency. She died in Rapid City in 1946. She was 75 years old. Grace is the hardest to write about, and the most important not to skip. Grace Pearl Ingalls was born in 1877 in Burr Oak, Iowa, during the period when the family had temporarily retreated from the failed Minnesota homestead. She was the youngest surviving daughter. She grew up in Smet during the town's early years, attended school with more continuity than her older sisters had managed, because by the time Grace was in school, the family had finally at last stopped moving. She married Nathan Dow, a farmer, in 1901, and spent her adult life farming near Manchester, South Dakota. She left almost no archive, no published writing, no memoir, no recovered letters. Historians of the Ingalls family have noted, with a kind of careful acknowledgement, that Grace's silence in the record is not evidence of unhappiness or failure. It is evidence of a life that was private, agricultural, and not oriented toward preserving itself in documents. She lived. She farmed the same kind of land her father had staked his life on, again and again across Dakota Territory. She died in November 1941. The world that had been shaped by her father's restless faith in the frontier absorbed her quietly and left behind almost nothing for scholars to find. There is something in that. Grace was the daughter who inherited the final stable version of her father's life. The de Smet years, the townhouse, the church, the school that didn't move. She benefited from all those years of relocation the way youngest children sometimes benefit from the exhaustion of their parents. The older siblings absorbed the full force of the instability, and by the time Grace arrived at childhood, Pa had finally kept his promise to Caroline. No more moves, and yet Grace ended up on a farm, on the same fragile, weather-dependent, economically precarious Great Plains soil that had broken her father's harvest more than once. Whether that was continuity or inevitability, or simply the only life available to a woman in her time and place, we cannot say. Her silence ensures we cannot say. What we can say is that she was real, and she was Pa's daughter, and she deserves to be named in the same breath as Mary and Carrie and Laura. She's not a footnote. She's the evidence that the frontier shaped all 4 of them, in ways both visible and invisible, and that the historical record honoured only the one who wrote. Now let's talk about Laura, not the Laura of the Little House books. That Laura has been examined in the chapters before this one, her editorial relationship with Rose Wilder Lane, the gap between Pioneer Girl's candour and the published series' warmth, the myth of pure self-reliance built on a government land grant. All of that has been turned over carefully already. This is about Laura at the end. She died on February 10th, 1957 in Mansfield, Missouri, 3 days after her 90th birthday. She had outlived Pa by 54 years. She had outlived Mary, Carrie, and Grace. She had outlived Almanzo, who died in 1949. She had outlived, in a certain sense, the frontier itself, that specific, legally defined, federally incentivized, historically brief period of American land claiming and subsistence farming that had shaped every year of her childhood was long over before she died. and she had spent the last 25 years of her life writing it back into existence. That is what the 8 Little House books represent when you read them with the historical record in one hand. They are not fabrication. They are not dishonesty. They are an act of sustained, deliberate emotional reconstruction, performed by a woman in her 60s and 70s, looking backward across a life that had also, in its adult chapters, been genuinely hard. The farm failures in Dakota, the unnamed infant son who died in 1889, whom Laura never wrote about in any published book, whose absence from the Little House series is a silence as pointed as Freddie's, as deliberate as the decision not to show Pa's failed harvests in full. Almanzo's illness after diphtheria struck them both in 1888, leaving him with a partial paralysis in his leg that he carried for years. The fire that destroyed their farmhouse, the departure from Dakota for Florida, then Missouri, the years at Rocky Ridge when the apple orchard wasn't yet producing, and the farm wasn't yet solvent, and the whole enterprise of having believed in land was being tested again. Laura survived all of that, and then, at 65, opened a notebook and began to remember her father as music. The question is not whether that was the wrong choice. It wasn't. The Little House books are emotionally true. Every scholar who has worked on them seriously, Carolyn Fraser, Pamela Smith Hill, John E. Miller, arrives at some version of the same conclusion. Laura did not falsify her childhood. She curated it. She kept what sustained love, and what taught resilience, and what made a reader feel that human beings are capable of more than their circumstances. She left out what broke things, what failed structurally, what was born unequally. The question is what that curation costs when it becomes mythology. When the curated version is the only version taught, the only version handed to children, the only version that most Americans hold when they think about what the frontier was. It costs Mary's voice. It costs Freddie's existence. It costs the honest accounting of how many times a loving father can stake everything on a new horizon before the people who move with him stop being partners in adventure and start being dependents in ongoing crisis. It costs the Wilder barn. That barn, the one introduced at the beginning of this story, the one in Burke, New York, then Malone, big enough to swallow a frontier shanty, full of stored hay and organised tools and horses powerful enough to pull more in a season than Pa sometimes harvested in Dakota. The Wilder family barn that was not just a building, but a balance sheet made of timber and stone, and years of accumulated margin. The barn didn't appear in the Little House books except in their atmosphere, in the security that Almanzo brought to his courtship of Laura. In the way Farmer Boy, the one book Laura wrote about her husband's childhood, reads differently from every other volume in the series, warmer, more abundant, a childhood of full plates and thriving livestock, and parents who expanded their farm rather than abandoning it. Farmers who stayed. That contrast was always there. Laura put it there. Whether she understood the full economic meaning of what she was describing is a question the record cannot answer with certainty. But the contrast is in the books. The Wilder farm full and settled. The Ingalls household moving and hoping and moving again. The barn was the physical symbol of everything Pa's family never had enough of. Not virtue, not love, not courage or music or the capacity to survive a Dakota blizzard on seed wheat and twisted hay. Those things the Ingalls family had in abundance. What they didn't have was margin. The cushion that lets a failed harvest be a bad year rather than a catastrophe. The reserve that lets a father's restlessness be adventure rather than displacement. The foundation that makes risk something you take from a position of strength rather than something you take because there is no other direction left to move. The Wilder barn was margin made visible, and the Ingalls family, loving, musical, courageous, faithful, genuinely beloved, never had one. The ledger book was introduced early in this story as a simple image, an old farm account book with lines for land, livestock, debts and sales. It was connected first to the Wilder side, an established New York farm plugged into markets, with entries that balanced and sometimes grew, and then to the Ingalls side. Claims filed and abandoned, harvests lost to grasshoppers and drought, daughters' labour pressed into service for family survival. A homestead proved up at last in 1886 for $16 in fees and then quietly stepped away from as the family moved into town. The Little House series is another kind of ledger. It balances differently. It counts Pa's warmth against his wandering and declares the warmth the defining entry. It records courage where the farm documents record debt. It places music in the column where the land records place abandonment. It is not a false ledger. It is a ledger kept by a daughter who understood, at a level so deep it functioned like instinct, that some accounts are too painful to publish at cost. But you can hold both ledgers at once, the historical one and the literary one. They do not cancel each other. They complete each other. The historical ledger shows a man who loved his daughters and whose love, however genuine, did not protect them from what his hope cost. It shows Mary at 37 years old, blind and dependent, in a house Pa built with his hands and left behind when his heart gave out. It shows Laura at 15, teaching school in a one-room building 12 miles from home, in temperatures she described as unbearable. Not because she wanted to teach at 15, but because the family needed the money. It shows Grace farming the same precarious soil her father had staked his life on, in the same Dakota territory that had tested the family again and again, with the same structural vulnerability to drought and commodity prices, and the long arithmetic of land without capital behind it. The literary ledger shows the fiddle playing at night. Both are true. That is the hardest thing the historical record asks you to hold. Not that Pa was bad, not that Laura lied, not that the frontier was only suffering. It asks you to hold the truth that love and cost are not opposites. That a father can play the most beautiful music in the world for his children in a dark winter, and still, by the weight of his choices, leave them carrying more than they should have had to carry. There is a house in Smet, South Dakota that still stands, the one Pa built on 3rd Street. Construction began in 1887, finished in 1889, and it is now a historic site operated by the Laura Ingalls Wilder Memorial Society. You can walk through it. You can stand in the rooms where Caroline lived after Pa died, where Mary spent 50 years of a life she never documented, where the daughters came and went across the decades while the prairie outside changed from frontier to farmland, to the quiet Main Street America of the mid-20th century. The house is small, careful, well made by a man who knew carpentry the way he knew most things, thoroughly and lovingly, without the resources to do it on the scale he might have imagined. It is the house that ended the moves, the one Pa finally built that the family finally kept, and if you stand in it long enough, in the quiet, the way the quiet actually settles in places like this, it stops being a historic site and starts being a question. Not the question the documentary title asks. That one, whether Pa died wondering if he failed his daughters, cannot be answered. We do not know what Charles Ingalls thought in the weeks before his heart gave out in June 1902. We do not have that letter. We do not have that diary entry. We have census records and land documents, and a death record and a house, and the 8 books his daughter wrote about the man she loved and the childhood she chose to remember. The question the house asks is quieter. It asks what it costs to build something on hope alone, when the structural conditions of the world you're living in make hope an insufficient foundation. It asks what the people who move with you absorb when the foundation shifts. It asks whether frontier grit, that specific celebrated mythology-generating quality that made Pierre Ingalls an American icon and made Laura's books a permanent fixture in elementary school libraries across a century, means the same thing when one family starts with a full New York barn behind them and another starts in a dugout on Plum Creek, with a failed harvest already behind them and another one coming. It asks whose courage we praise and whose cost we quietly omit from the story we hand to children. The fiddle is gone. The Smet house stands. The homestead site is marked by a historical plaque on the South Dakota prairie, grass moving in the wind the way it moved in 1880, the way it moved when the family was new here, and Pa believed this was the last claim he'd ever need to file. Rocky Ridge Farm in Mansfield, Missouri, where Laura lived for 60 years and wrote the books that made her father immortal, still has the apple orchard, still has the farmhouse she and Almanzo built. It is a museum now, too. You can walk through Laura's house as well, the one she finished at 47, the one Pa never saw completed, the one that represents something the historical ledger acknowledges carefully. Laura achieved a stability her father never quite managed. On land she and Almanzo worked together, in a state far from Dakota, in a life that bore almost no resemblance to the pioneer myth she spent the last quarter century of her life writing. She built her security by writing about the years before security existed. The irony is not cruel, it is human, and earned, and complicated. She gave her father back to the world in the form she needed him to be: warm, brave, musical, moving toward the next horizon with a smile rather than a desperate calculation about whether this claim would finally hold. History gives him back in the form the record shows: a man who loved deeply and risked repeatedly and left his daughters in the care of everything he hoped for, not everything he could guarantee. There's a close both ledgers now. Not because the accounting is finished, it never quite is, in families like this one, but because this is where the honest reckoning settles into something you simply have to hold. Pa Ingalls was not a villain. He was a man of his time, shaped by the same structural optimism that the federal government stamped onto 160-acre parcels and called opportunity. He was a man who believed the next claim would be the one that held, because the whole architecture of mid-19th century American life told working men without inherited capital that the frontier was the only place where a man like him could build something real. He was also a man whose daughters taught school at 15 and went blind without adequate medical care, and farmed the same precarious soil, and left almost no archive, and built their adult lives on whatever margin they could manufacture out of intelligence and labour, and whatever quiet inheritance of resilience their father had given them in lieu of the kind he couldn't. Both of those things are true at the same time. The books remember Pa's music. The record remembers the moves. Laura made sure the music would outlast her. The record makes sure the moves are not forgotten. Between them, in the space where Mary's voice should be and isn't, in the silence Grace left behind, in the farmhouse Carrie didn't write about and the apple orchard Laura built, decades after Pa's last hope was finally, irrevocably, quietly filed, lives the most honest thing this story can offer. Not a verdict on a loving father, not an indictment of a daughter who chose memory over history. Just a question, asked with the full weight of the ledger behind it, addressed to no one in particular, and to everyone who has ever loved a parent whose hope cost them something. Can a person give everything they have and still leave the people they love with not quite enough? The house in Smet is still standing. It doesn't answer. It just holds the quiet and lets it sit.